Welcome to episode 9 of the Expert Cruise Show. I'm Anthony, he's Chris, and between us we've worked out we have nearly 700 years of experience of cruising ocean liners, the ships and their history. And you've probably seen Chris on board some of the ships, certainly Cunard, soon to be Celebrity 2, where he lectures about his lifelong love of ocean liners. He's very much a maritime historian. I have worked as a travel journalist, but my love also goes back to Titanic and the history of Cunard Line. But we travel on all the lines now, and as we're recording this, tomorrow I'm hitting Royal Caribbean with the kids, and the week after I'll be on Cunard's Queen Mary 2. So, we're traveling as much as we can and reporting back to you. But really the idea of this show is if you combine this show with watching the vloggers who have all their amazing shows, which we're a big fan of, you should get enough intel to make sure that you always have the very best cruise. Does that kind of sum it up, Chris, do you think?
I think so, yeah. And there's so many wonderful vloggers out there who do the experiences on board the ships. And then if you bring this show in, it gives you context about not just the industry, but also the different types of ships, the different ways you can book on cruise ships, the different types of cruises, what the different cruise lines bring. So it helps sort of round out that knowledge.
I just think, years ago we used to watch travel shows on terrestrial television where professional presenters would go on trips, and you used to think that's just the best job in the world. And though, I don't have regular TV anymore, so I don't even know if those shows exist. But I miss the days we had people like Judith Chalmers in the UK. She was wonderful. She had the greatest suntan, and she was always off jetting somewhere, and we'd always sit at home and be like, Judith has really nailed this life. She really has. But these days, it's almost better to get an opinion from somebody who is taking the vacation themselves, paying for the vacation themselves, and actually is there without a crew and doesn't, have to kind of play to the camera. Because a lot of the time, years ago, these travel journalists, a couple of them, Alan Wicker was the original in the UK, going back to the 1950s.
Yeah,
but
he did Around the World on the QE2 for his show.
Right,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I worked with him once, actually. In fact, if you're interested in a quick diversion,
sure.
I worked with Alan Wicker at a corporate event, and they build these temporary stages and backdrops, and I was hosting, and he took a step back, missed his footing, disappeared back. The whole set collapsed around him, and his glasses fell off, and he was quite an old man by then, and I jumped down, and I was like, "Are you all right?" And he was like, "Oh, where are my glasses?" And we kind of bonded in that moment. Do you know what I mean? But I go back and I watch a lot of his shows, and a friend of mine now, randomly, was one of his producers on those travel shows, and I've heard some incredible stories about those trips. And he loved Cunard, and he loved the kind of days of the ocean liner. But bringing it back up to modern day, a professional presenter, unless they are a seasoned travel journalist like Alan Wicker was or Judith Chalmers, they're really just acting. They're just kind of pretending to be happy all the time and celebrating the trip. But I love watching people be a little disappointed. I love them. I love them managing mediocrity. I take pleasure from their every whim and desire, and so I'm a big fan. And so I'm thrilled that so many of the cruise vloggers have started to engage with this show as well. And if you want to give us a shout out, then we'll definitely give you a shout out. I was messaging with Carol and Paul. I never know if it's Carol or Paul who are responding to the messages, but I always like to sign off with "right then," which is one of their catchphrases.
Yeah.
But So today
And then
we're going
also,
to talk. Yes.
earlier in episode, I think it was episode 1 when we were introducing the show, we had
Yes.
some footage of the Margaritaville at Sea Paradise, which was
That's right,
brought to us by
yes.
Fraser at Sea. And he's got a remarkable story as well as a vlogger, because he actually spent a year jumping from cruise ship to cruise ship, living at sea,
Right.
which I think is remarkable.
Which is very hard to do because
Yeah.
unless you're paying for a world voyage, which is insane money, you kind of have to schedule yourself on back-to-back cruises and
Yes.
then work out which other ships are going to be in port when you're in port on a different ship, and then jump ship, as they say. So it's quite a specialized thing, working out how to live at sea affordably. It's quite a responsibility, making sure that you don't miss anything, especially if you are committed to living at sea. But a few people have done this, and famously there's some people who've retired onto cruise ships because it's cheaper than a retirement home if you know how to book it and you price it right. But do
Do you remember the lady who lived on the QE2?
Yes.
B. Miller, I think her name was.
Right.
She was on board, I think, for 10 years. And
she did switch to Queen Mary 2, I think, didn't she, briefly?
Well, I think she tried Queen Mary 2. I think when QE2 retired, there was a period where she also had to go on land. I'm not exactly sure where she ended up long term. If you do know, maybe drop us a note in the comments. But she was famous towards the end of QE2's career because she was the lady who'd lived on the ship for so long.
And as you know, on this show we try to make the best with the smallest budget. And I'm always recommending that if you're not doing an inside cabin, which is invariably a quarter of the price of a balcony cabin, there are always anomaly cabins and ocean view cabins that offer you something a little bit better, where you do get a little bit of daylight. But, as they say, people who book inside, they sleep the best because there's no light leakage. But today we're going to talk about different types of cruises, including the fly cruise and the various different ways of doing it. And I would probably start this by saying that the way the world is these days, doing international travel with all the stress at the airport and any of that kind of stuff, I would always put those trips secondary to doing local cruising if possible. So if you live within a few hours of a cruise port, it's always worth finding the trips that go from your local cruise port first, because it's going to be cheaper, most likely. But also, it means that when you finish the cruise, this is what I find, and I live about an hour from the closest cruise port, is that there's nothing better for me than driving my own car to the cruise terminal, parking right next to the ship, walking about 100 yards to the ship itself, getting on board, and the vacation starting immediately.
Absolutely.
And conversely, when the cruise is over, I always like to stay on till the very end. I'm always the last person to get off the ship. Last one off. And just to stretch it out as much as possible. And I like to get off and walk back to the car, and an hour later you're home. And there's nothing worse than doing a trip where you've got like a 6 or a 10-hour flight, and afterwards when you eventually get home, and it's always late at night or early in the morning, but the hours are always wrong. And you're like, oh, we need a vacation now. Like you literally need a vacation to recover from your vacation. So maybe we should start by talking about the how useful it is to really focus your travel from your home port if you have one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that depending on where you are, it depends on how easy this is. Like, I have noticed, where I'm based in Australia, we have Sydney and Brisbane are really the two ports on the east coast of Australia where there's a reasonable amount of home port cruising. And Sydney is significantly more than all the others. But Carnival, who has a year-round presence here now as well, they have 2 ships based out in summer. They have 2 ships based out of Brisbane and 2 ships based out of Sydney. So those, and the landmass is so vast that if you live in Brisbane or if you live in Sydney or potentially the greater suburban area, that's perfectly reasonable thing to contemplate doing. But if you're in like anywhere else in the country, you're flying somewhere basically. And the whole element of that is that when you're living in a place that has a setup like that, you kind of get used to the idea that you're going to be flying to get to the various destinations, to get to the ship. Then when for example, like we're going on the Transatlantic 185th anniversary Cunard voyage. I've got to get there. There is a flight up to an Asian airport to connect to a flight across to the UK. They do direct flights from Australia now on Qantas, but the price is so expensive. So you're talking probably about a full day of travel, right? So it's something that you just kind of get used to. But then I go to Southampton and I'm talking to people who live in the UK, and because the UK geographically is so much smaller than Australia, you could be in a nearby city to Southampton, but not in Southampton or not even in London, and it's a day trip to get down to the down to the ship. So it's a completely different.
And you always want to get there the day before, ideally, and get a cheap budget hotel, just something that takes the anxiety out of being too late for the ship. And so building in an extra day to the cruise is probably less necessary on the return, but certainly on the outbound, that's the case. And for people like you who lecture on board, there isn't always the time to be able to do that. So there is that risk of like, am I going to catch the ship?
Yes, that's so true. I mean, probably the closest that I've had it is arriving into the UK the day before, but generally we'll try and do a longer little stint beforehand. I think I mentioned in a previous episode about the Queen Anne maiden voyage and how there was a special event in Southampton on board the ship.
That's right.
That's where I met Paul and Carol.
Yeah,
well, I missed the beginning part of it, but I arrived for the evening rather, and of course because people were overnighting on board, I got to overnight on the ship and then spend the next morning on board as well. But I always knew that was going to happen. However, the flights had been there were some issues around airspace clearance even back then. And so they'd been rerouted, and we did this very long trip. And I remember being in Singapore, and the captain said it's going to be a long diversion around this area where they couldn't fly.
Oh, no.
And I'm looking at the schedule and going, oh my gosh, we're going to get there. But it actually, funnily enough, worked out all right. But fortunately, the ship wasn't sailing that night. But I did get a couple of other people that I knew who were staying on board for that visit. They got themselves a bit confused, and they thought the ship was going on a little cruise for overnight. And so I got these messages saying like, are you coming on board because we're going to be sailing this evening? And I was like, what are you talking about?
Freaking you out.
Yeah. But that's the other thing. Then you look at say the United States, and one of the great things that occurred, and one of the actual friends of the cruise ship, which was an enemy of the ocean liner, is the aircraft. Because when the cruise industry was developing, they initially started thinking about offering cruises out of the traditional hubs where the transatlantic liners or other ocean liners would be based. So New York is a perfect example. And shipping lines like Cunard, who had been very much involved in that transatlantic passage, they would offer cruises from New York down to the Caribbean and back. But you've got multiple days at sea before you get to the destination, the place where people want to visit. Yeah. And it was the likes of Carnival and Royal Caribbean and Norwegian that thought, we don't need to sail out of New York. We can actually sail out of Florida. And they started to base these cruise hubs in Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And because they then didn't have that history with the airlines of being sort of a competitive threat, they looked at them as an advantage, and they started working out ways in which they could work with the airlines, and in Carnival's case, even had its own airline for a little while, to fly people from all over the country to these hubs to do these cruises. And because they then had economies of scale in these ports, the price went down. And that kind of gave this birth to home porting for people in that region, but also at the same time it became a fly cruise option for people all across the country, which I think is one of the reasons why cruising was so successful in that period of time.
And the differential between paying for the flight yourself or having the cruise line book it was significant. You know, the cruise line had these deals with the airlines, and it barely cost any more. As I mentioned last week, you know, we were talking about how Queen Mary, the QE2 or the Queen Mary 2 used to advertise a crossing for £500, which included a return flight from New York. So the fly cruise, there are two reasons why I would also recommend a fly cruise. The first is that if the if the cruise line is booking your airline tickets and it's part of the package, you are guaranteed to get there for the ship. And that is baked into the cruise contract. Is that, you know, you book through them, they will get you there. And the other advantage of booking the flights with the cruise as well, especially if it's advertised as a fly cruise, but even if it's not, you know, all the cruise lines now, flights by Celebrity, flights by Carnival, they have their own kind of flights department who are very, very good, very experienced people invariably. But they're always booking you on refundable flights, which are very expensive if you're trying to do that yourself direct. But when you book them through the cruise line, a refundable flight is not that much more than a regular bucket flight. And so there is the option that if you find flights that are cheaper direct, or if you want to change your booking, then they're able to do that, which is not something that's so easy when you're kind of trying to book the cheapest flight yourself direct with the airline.
Yeah. You know, it's also interesting as well because as the markets around the world develop, you're seeing some changes in various regions as well. So, you know, Star Cruises has just relaunched in Asia, offering cruises out of Singapore and out of Hong Kong. And Royal Caribbean actually has positioned some of their ships. In fact, I think even one of some of the larger classes of ships are coming to the Asia Pacific region. We've definitely had the Ovation here, for example, and they'll base themselves out of Singapore or out of Hong Kong or out of other Asian ports to offer home-based cruising for those very large populations of people who've never really had access to that before. But they'll also advertise into places like Australia and into New Zealand where the flight isn't 24 hours to get there. It's, you know, 6 or 7. And so we've got friends here who are traveling up to Singapore to travel on Royal Caribbean ships that are based out of Singapore for the season. So you have this combination of fly cruise for some markets, but at the same time, home-based cruising for other markets, which really didn't exist in the 1980s and 1990s. There were only certain hubs that were developed, and everything else was sort of you have to get to the ship.
Yes. Well, you do what you can, but it means that you get a greater choice of ships, a greater choice of lines, if you're prepared to kind of add that bit onto your vacation. And if the cruise line is offering it, knowing the routes and knowing where their customer base is, then it's always cost effective. But, you know, living in England, obviously Southampton would be the main port for most of the ships, but there was already also Harwich that I took the Carnival Splendor from one time, which is in Essex, I think. And then there's Liverpool, which occasionally has ships go from as well. And so, you know,
I mean, Fred Olsen's very good at using multiple ports in the UK.
Right.
They don't base all their cruises out of Southampton. And I seem to remember that Disney was doing its embarkations in Dover. At least that was the plan, perhaps pre-pandemic. But they were looking at different ports so that, because Southampton's obviously like the main gateway, but it's also very busy there. There's lots of ships coming in there.
Yeah, well, they have like 4 terminals now. So, you know, there is this ability to kind of, you know, chop and change and share. It used to just be the QE2, I think, now, but now you have the Ocean Terminal and various others.
The thing that amazed me about Southampton, and it's just remarkable every time you're there, is that if you know Southampton and you know where the train station is, for example, and then you think about where the line of piers are, where Mayflower and all those piers terminals are, that whole area is reclaimed land. It was all claimed from the sea.
Right.
So it's a very different port to what it was, originally, and that's one of the key reasons why it became such a huge hub, because they could build that long area there with all those piers and lots of the logistics around that as well. But all on reclaimed land. So if you go into the the IKEA and that sort of thing, it's all sort of sitting there near where that reclaimed water is. That is quite remarkable.
And the pier that Titanic went from is now used as a kind of commercial freight port. So, or the berth, I should say, the berth that it used. So I don't think any of the cruise ships go from the same berth as Titanic did in Southampton. But if
the
you
closest
ask
you can
around,
get is Kiwi 2. Yeah.
Yeah. You can actually see it as you sail out. You can see it on the opposite side of the harbour. It's just a historic port. But I like I say, for me, like if I was to fly to Miami or Fort Lauderdale for a cruise, which I have done, it's a long way. It's a long flight, and I feel like the ship needs to be worth it. Right, I wouldn't do it for the shorter trips that I would do closer to home on the West Coast. I'll take a less good ship potentially because I'm not having to fly, and it's only a few days. And I've been thinking about trying the Royal Caribbean Ovation of the Seas, which is here, and the what's the other one? That's the Quantum of the Seas, which is the original in that class. Yeah, and so, because it's close and because it's cheap and because it's 2 or 3 or 4 nights, and it's kind of worth it. But if I was going to fly to Miami or even fly to London, it would have to be for a really good ship. And I did fly to Miami for the Celebrity Beyond, and it was totally worth it because the Edge class ships had not yet come to the West Coast, and so it was definitely worth the flight. But it's not. There's no pleasure. I love to fly, as do you, but the airport experience is increasingly uncomfortable. Just the sheer number of people, the way you get treated by TSA, and that's why I always recommend, if you can get things like Global Entry or TSA Pre or any of these, Clear, any of these services that enable you to jump the line at security, and it does make life a hell of a lot easier. And some of them are not that expensive. I think TSA Pre is about $70, and it lasts for 4 years.
Goodness, okay. Yeah.
It's actually worth it if you are going to be doing any travel in the US.
I think the other thing that's fortunate for us here is that our airport experience is not as bad as that, and also when you fly to Europe, particularly from Australia or from Asia, you get to go through hubs like Singapore, which is just the most glorious airport.
Wonderful
the facilities
airports.
there,
Yeah, wonderful. And it's the same with Dubai or any of these kind of modern Middle Eastern airports, of which they build more and more all the time.
Yeah.
And yet, unfortunately, the UK's airports are a disaster, and America, all of the US airports. I think maybe there's like one nice one. I think Portland was recently rebuilt and is beautiful. Yeah. But, Atlanta, any of these, LAX, any of these are just an absolutely horrific experience for the traveler. And there is really no joy transiting these places. So if you are able to route yourself via places like Qatar or the UAE, you will have a much nicer experience.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the travel distances are getting a bit longer at the moment because there's so many areas that they can't fly over on that routing.
Right.
At the moment, all the aircraft that used to fly across Iranian airspace, for example, are being diverted down towards Egypt and actually following up the Gulf of Suez and flying over the canal, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
But it just adds extra time, which then you have to take into account. And some people can't fly. When the world shut down in 2020, Anthony, I was on board the Queen Mary 2, and it was in Australia on its world voyage, which is another type of cruise that we'll touch on. But it stopped its services in Fremantle. which is on the west coast of Australia. And everybody was asked to leave the ship. Fortunately for me, I lived in the country, so I just left the ship, and it was relatively straightforward for me. But for a lot of people who were doing the world cruise, they were unable to sail back, but they then had to try and find, the company had to try and find them alternate flights. But of course, the airlines were shutting down too, so it was quite stressful. But there were some people, after visiting the medical facilities on board, who were deemed unable to fly, or not well enough to fly, or not physically able to do it for whatever reason. And so when the ship sailed back, empty, she actually had, I think it was 260 or so passengers on board, who had this massive ocean liner with all the crew and just them for that return voyage, which must have been such a surreal experience.
Wow. Let's we have to finish soon, but let's talk about world cruises. We touched on it with people trying to live on a ship, and as we said, it's probably cheaper if you're going to live on a ship just to schedule yourself back-to-back cruises rather than going on a world voyage. I was looking up the cheapest world cruises for 2026.
Okay.
Because it's not a bad idea to get off this planet if you can. And interestingly, and somebody wrote to us in the comments, actually, I think for episode 1, that the price of Cunard's Queen Anne had been slashed because there wasn't great feedback about the ship, and Cunard purists didn't like the ship as much as the other 3 ships, and so prices were coming down. And would you know that the Cunard Queen Anne is actually the cheapest, £9,599 sterling per person for an inside cabin for a world cruise, 108 nights.
Goodness. That's very strange, isn't it?
Right.
Because, I'm a Cunard fan as well, but I would definitely rate the ship much higher than that. Particularly against some of the older ships that are doing world cruises. That's interesting. That's a very interesting fact.
Yeah, it is interesting. And P&O offered, was it P&O or it was another one? No, I think Queen Mary 2 was offering a 108-night cruise from £42,000 per person for a Queen's Grill suite. That's like high end. But, we talk about a world cruise, and 108 nights, it's only really a third of the year, isn't it? And it'll be over in a flash. I would like my world cruise to take at least a year if I had the opportunity to do it.
I think that's it. There's so many different types, different ships that are offering world cruises, but they generally follow a very similar pattern of it being about 3 months, about 100 or so nights. And, you see the itineraries, and generally will try and take in the major attractions across the world. We've just had one from here on the Crown Princess on a Sydney to Sydney return world cruise, just depart Australia, which is, showing that there's more demand for world cruising out of hubs and ports that wouldn't normally be the starting point, because traditionally world cruises would have started in either America or in Europe. But, what's interesting about that is that because the world has different hemispheres in different seasons, you start a world cruise in Europe, for example, and you have to inevitably get across the Atlantic. It's quite often in January. It can quite often be a rough start. Here they're starting in June, and they're departing from Australia in winter, going through the Southern Ocean. The Crown Princess was rocked around quite a lot on that passage, and in fact, there's some fantastic videos on YouTube that show the ship moving in the water, and the captain on the PA saying sort of like, we've been obviously impacted by the weather, but ultimately they try and find the sun. And that was one of the ideas behind this global voyage, this world cruise, was to try and escape at the time the northern winter, and take people on this remarkable exploration around the world. And look, there's so many different cruise lines and shipping lines that have claimed to be the first world cruise. If you look it up historically, there's even modern day lines that will say they did the first ever world cruise. But if you trace it back, and we've done this for our book, The Evolution of the Passenger Ship, when you actually go through all of the historical documents and trace it back, there's so many different companies that could claim ownership of that, because initially world cruises were like that grand voyage where you would do a world voyage, but it was on 4 or 5 different ships. And then they decided to start doing them on continuous voyages with one ship. But they weren't the cruise line alone doing this. They would provide the ship, but they would partner with travel organizations such as American Express, who had a huge subscriber base, and would say, look, this is an exclusive American Express voyage, and the American Express would sell the voyage. So Cunard, for example, who did its first continuous world cruise back in late in 1922 and early 1923, they actually provided the ship, but it was American Express that organized the passengers. So it was all done in partnerships, which is again quite similar to some of the ways that they do it now. Because some organizations, in fact, with big employee bases or big subscriber bases, will actually charter ships for special voyages, which can quite often be long duration voyages as part of conferences or other such things. I did notice just recently, funnily enough, just to digress for a second, but Star Trek does a cruise once a year. And it's a Star Trek themed cruise. It's on a Royal Caribbean ship, but they organize it all through their travel partners. And they have, William Shatner's been on board. They have different, the different actors from the different Star Trek characters across all those different series. And the whole trip is about Star Trek. The ship's just the venue, which is like taking the conference to sea, which is quite interesting.
I do like the idea of themed cruises. I haven't really done any, but the UK, a lot of these kind of old 80s singers, pop stars, they band together and do these kind of retro cruises, and they're very popular. Do you remember back in I think it was in December 2023, Royal Caribbean advertised this ultimate world cruise that was a 274-night round-the-world sailing, began in Miami, concluded on the 10th of September in 2024.
Yeah, I remember that, yes.
All 7 continents, 65 countries, 150 ports of call, including 16 overnights and 8 world wonders as they advertised it. But what was so interesting is they invited a bunch of vloggers on board, and it became the most kind of vlogged cruise of all. YouTube was just chocker. And what was so interesting was it was a little bit like, Big Brother. They threw all these vloggers onto a ship to see who would promote Royal Caribbean and how they would form relationships, and some of them started dating and others started fighting, and it created such an incredible media buzz to be on this ship. And a lot of them had never been on a cruise before. They were just vloggers, they did other things. They weren't necessarily all travel vloggers. And so it really was a little bit, it was a kind of cross between Animal Farm and and Lord of the Flies. And it was very interesting. I really enjoyed watching some of these people. But the best thing about it was that it was quite I can't remember what ship it was, but it was quite an old Royal Caribbean ship, a Voyager class, I think.
I think it was Voyager class, yeah.
Right. And people had a really great time. They had a really great time, but it was such a brilliant way to market cruising and Royal Caribbean specifically, without needing a budget for marketing, really. You just invited these vloggers and let them just do their thing. Yeah. And it made for some fascinating content.
I mean, back in the day, I think the world cruise used to be so heavily skewed towards retirees because there was no connection on the ships. Like, as we talked about in a previous episode, it was faxes and letters back in the 80s and 90s.
But the retirees were also the only people that could afford it. That was the other thing. They'd been saving up their whole lives.
In 2011, we were on Queen Elizabeth, and it was doing its world cruise, and we met some passengers on board who were in a Queen's Grill suite, doing the whole world cruise. In 2011, the internet on board the ships was like Morse code speed, so it was very, very slow. And they were younger, and he was quite high up in business, and so he actually was telling us that when the ship arrived in Hong Kong, his wife was staying on board, but he was going to leave the ship in Hong Kong, fly to the States to do a series of meetings that he had to be there for in person, and then he'd fly back and meet the ship in Singapore. These days with Starlink, if you get a good connection and if you've got, the faster package, because they do slow it down unless you pay extra on most of the cruise lines.
Can I just say something on that?
Yeah.
The slow one is not the internet.
No.
It just isn't.
No.
It's like a 56K dial-up modem.
Yeah.
So never think, because some of these, I mean, even Cunard, for example, if you go Queen's Grill and they include internet, invariably it's the slow internet.
Yeah.
Well, it's pointless. You might as well just not have it. And so I really want people to start thinking that if they want internet, it's the premium Wi-Fi or nothing, because otherwise it's like just messaging. It's like being on a plane. Sorry, carry on.
You can't even access the YouTube app on the slow one. Like, it just won't even open. And you know what I know, this is one of my pet peeves, I suppose. But like, knowing that they are literally getting the fast signal and then the technology that they've got on board is slowing it down drives me nuts. I'm sure it does everyone.
It's profit. Remember, this is an upsell that never used to exist.
Of course.
There is huge profit being made by the cruise line. Yeah,
back in the day, it was you pay for minutes, and you had to be really smart because the internet was so slow. So you'd log on. You probably remember this, but you'd log on, you go to your webmail, you'd download all the emails, and you'd log off, write the replies, and then you'd log on to send them all, because you just would lose your time. But anyway, so he was going to fly back and meet the ship. Now, of course, you wouldn't have to do that, which means that if people who are still working, who couldn't traditionally take 3 months away from whatever it is, they could potentially now do some of that on the ship. And you do actually see more. I mean, it's nice, and it's also sad. You do see more and more people with laptops out on deck doing, work. You say to them, how was your day? And I was was online for a few hours with the office or whatever. And, it makes my life a lot easier as well, because I do work on board with whilst I'm doing the lectures, but also, videos and articles and that sort of thing that need to be sent on time. But at the same time, it was so nice back in a time pre-internet where you would leave port and that was it until the next port. Yeah. It's
changed, but I would say now that because I work completely remotely, and I've managed to create a travel kit of technology that is scaled down so much. I have this fold out, it's like a transformer. It's a laptop stand that puts the laptop up high, so the camera is up high, because you don't want it low because of all the chins and everything like that. So you want the camera up high. And I have this incredible fold out. It was quite expensive, but it folds down to nothing. It's not that heavy. And it just, it saves me having to find books to pile the laptop up on. And just having a travel kit that enables me to record and communicate and write and do my work, and then it takes the stress out of thinking, oh, I can't really travel, I've got too much work on. And I think that for me, that's the joy. Turn the cabin into the office, and then you can leave the office and go to the ship. Use the rest of the ship, which is not your office. I guess it's different if you're a travel vlogger and you've got your GoPro on the go all the time.
Well, that's probably why the travel vloggers are so interested in how many USB ports there are, because they've got to keep all their technology.
Exactly, because they've got to charge all their gear. Yes, it is interesting. So, living on a ship, I would do it 100%. I don't know that I could do it in an inside cabin, and that's probably all I could afford. So, this is the thing. You need to either be independently wealthy, or you need a lottery win, or you need to, I guess, be sponsored, go on one of these sponsored world cruises and have it crowdfunded or paid for you by the cruise line. But it would be very interesting. I suppose, I'm sure you have the same fantasy as I do, but the idea of retiring onto a cruise just seems like such a great idea, to live on vacation.
Yeah, I was actually, funnily enough, introduced in 2008 as the youngest ever guest speaker on the QE2, which is something that is quite unusual to have a person in their 20s doing the guest speaking.
Right.
But I always thought to myself when I was building this career that it's a great retirement career as well, because most of the guest speakers who come on board who have an interesting story from their life to tell have retired from that career and now do the guest speaking circuit.
Yes.
So I kind of have this
you
sort
keep
of
it going in parallel for a while, and of course the king of your world is Bill Miller, who was a school teacher in Hoboken, New Jersey, and then would just go off on these trips and come back and tell all the kids about his travels. And eventually he retired as a teacher, and now is able to spend much more time at sea. But
I've got to tell you a little story about Bill.
Yes.
He was the guest speaker on a Trans-Pacific Queen Mary 2 voyage that we were doing, and Rochelle and I had written the manuscript for our QE2 book, QE2 A Photographic Journey, and this voyage was it was the first time Queen Mary 2 was coming to Australia, and it had just left San Francisco for the first time, so huge interest, and we were on board. This 2007, and Bill was the guest speaker on board, and of course I had all Bill's books, and I'd seen him in documentaries. There's this wonderful documentary that was made here, but it was syndicated globally called The Liners, and him and John Maxtone Graham and a few other very well-known maritime historians, and I kind of grew up on that. And so went to Bill's lectures, and then eventually got a chance to come and have a chat with him. And he was proofing his Canberra book about the P&O liner Canberra. And we got talking, and I just said to him, look, Rochelle and I have written this manuscript, but we don't really know any publishers. And so Bill, bless him, he says to me, this guy who he's only just really met on the ship. Look, when you get home, send me the manuscript, and if I think it's got potential, I'll give you feedback and I can help you find a publisher. And he did, and he actually introduced me to the people who ultimately formed the History Press, and that's where we got our first book published. And he did our foreword. Bill did the foreword on this book.
Wonderful.
Now, he had no reason to do this. He didn't know me at the time. I was probably just one of 1,000 maritime history geeks that came up to him and said, like, I've written a book. But he did. And 18 books later, we always send him a copy of the next one that comes out as a thank you, because it would really, that first foot in the door was all thanks to his generosity. So he's a very special guy.
John Maxtone Graham would never have done that for you. That's for certain. So
no, I actually emailed John Maxtone Graham after I got his Norway book, and we had a little chat, but it wasn't quite the same level of
he cut from a different cloth. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Bill's just such a wonderful, wonderful man.
Yeah. And hopefully,
and you're friends with him. You're very good friends with him too.
I'm good friends with him. Yeah. And who was I? I mean, he met me randomly off the Hoboken ferry, because my mum had met him on the Queen Mary 2 and was like, my son would love you, and he was like, great, just let's get tea. Yeah. So there are a few gems left in this world, and I think it's important that we remember them. And if we can get Bill on the show, which he's shown interest in, I think that would be a wonderful thing to do in the future.
Well, I think coming up in future episodes, we've got so many contacts and friends in this wonderful world of maritime that we will start to bring some guests onto the show as well.
Yeah, well, look, there's a space here and there's a space there, and you've got a couple of spaces next to you as well. So we'll start to fill it with some of the kind of the stars of the cruising industry. All right, listen, we have to finish, but we would say that this kind of new venture, even though we're this many episodes in now to the Expert Cruise Show, we adore your feedback. So please hit the like, the subscribe, the bell for notifications of new videos, but also your comments are most helpful, both on this platform or however you're receiving this show.
Sure.
And we'll always do our best to write back and take on any feedback and ideas for future conversations.
And look, I mean, if you're watching this on YouTube and you have to go, I don't know, pick the kids up or go to the shops or whatever, you can always pick it up also on the podcasting platforms as well. So it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the podcasting platforms, and all the episodes are named the same. So you'll be able to find it and then just pick up from where you left off.
Very good. All right. See you next time. Happy cruising.
See you next time. Take care.